The X-Zone Radio Show with Rob McConnell is largely an opinion talk show. All opinions, comments, or statements of fact expressed by Rob McConnell's guests are strictly their own and are not to be construed as those of the X-Zone Radio Show or endorsed in any manner by Rob McConnell, Relmar McConnell Media Company, the X-Zone Broadcast Network, its affiliated networks, stations, employees, or advertisers.
All Hit Radio.
Welcome to the X Zone, a place where fact is fiction and fiction is reality. Now, here's your host, Rob McConnell.
Good evening, one and all, and welcome to the X-Zone. I am Rob McConnell, and for the next 3 hours, I am your host. I am your guide as we cross the time-space continuum to this place that I call the X-Zone. It's a place where fact is fiction and fiction is reality. And I'll tell you something, X-Zone Nation, after doing this show live on air for 25 years, that is an understatement. Let me tell you that. If you'd like to send an email, studio@X-Zone Radio TV on all social media sites, X-Zone Radio TV, and our website, www.xzone radio TV, where you can find out what we've done, what we're doing, and, well, if you're psychic, you don't need to know what we're doing because you already know that, right? But if you're not psychic, or if you just want to test yourself as being a psychic, you can always find out what we're going to be doing in the future there as well. Also, our Facebook group page, www.facebook.com/groups/X-Zone Radio TV. My guest this hour is a gentleman that we had on, last week or the week before. We ran out of time, found this gentleman to be very interesting, and asked him to come back, and he graciously accepted our invitation. Greg Lawson is his name, and he is a 10-year military veteran and career law enforcement officer with over 24 years of experience. He has worked as a mental health investigator and a child abuse, sex crimes, and homicide detective. He specializes in interview techniques and investigating procedures, also teaches these disciplines to Texas law enforcement officers. He began his fascination with the paranormal at an early age and was informally ghost hunting while in high school in the 1980s. That's way before it became very popular, as you all know, X-Zone Nation. His expansive and diverse background, along with his academic studies, leads to his interdisciplinary approach. One of his specialties is a 10-year study of the reported UFO crash at Roswell, New Mexico. His unique perspective of the incident imparts a whole host of possibilities to the mysteries of that event. Greg is the author of 4 books and has traveled to over 50 countries, conducting his very own investigation of the phenomenon and the people that experience it. His website, www.greglawson.com. And Greg, welcome back to the X-Zone. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation to come on back and amaze us some more.
Thanks. It's my pleasure.
All right, Greg, last time you were with us, we were discussing the Roswell case, the Roswell incident, and we ran out of time. So what I'd like to do is, if you could, just give us a recap of your investigative findings and how it differs or how it is similar to other investigations that have been done on Roswell.
Well, I certainly don't want to take anything away from the people that I've studied that have already done the work. Honestly, my work has been very, very limited in the amount of hands-on. I have relied on the on the greats that have spent thousands and thousands of man hours to actually collect the amount of data that they've collected, and the amount of witness interviews and experience. So I'm riding on the back of Stanton Freeman and Tom Carrion and Don Schmidt and Kevin Randall and a whole host of others. Somebody asked me that the other day, and I try to point out that I study. I'm a paranormal researcher. I study the process and methods that other people use in order to make their assertions. So that is what I have really done as far as the Roswell story.
Well, let me ask you this. As a veteran of law enforcement, a homicide detective, a sexual abuse crime unit detective, and a child abuse detective, as well as a mental health investigator, doesn't your own investigation, or wouldn't your own investigative techniques and your own investigation findings play a much more pivotal part of the investigation if you had been the person to do the original investigation? And how does it differ that you're using second and third hand information to come up to your conclusions?
Well, you have to consider that this case is a cold case.
Right.
They shut it down in 1947, and Stanton Friedman, basically resurrected it 30 plus years later. So, quite naturally, most, if not all, of your evidence is either degraded or it is absolutely completely destroyed, moved, hidden, whatever you want to use as far as the physical evidence. And I'm a data and evidence guy.
Right.
I work with some people that I just love watching them interview and cross-examine people. And a lot of the people that I work with think that I'm good at that. I do not. I think I'm a master student at trying to figure out whether somebody is trying to smoke me or not. And so, to answer your question, the whole story was resurrected as a story.
Yes.
They told the story and then they wanted to investigate it. So that's in any paranormal investigation or any law enforcement or insurance fraud or whatever, when you are you trying to investigate to find out what happens, or are you trying to gather evidence to support your claim? So that's the real danger with in law enforcement, is if you have some cop that already has an idea, in his own mind, in his own paradigm, he's created this set of circumstances, and he says, I'm going to investigate this so I can conclude what my assertion is.
Right.
And that's, that's one way to look at it. But as you can see, your perspective in what you're doing could definitely taint the investigation.
But the fact that the majority of Roswell so-called investigators are not investigators, they're basically hobbyists. Doesn't that kind of make what they do not as credible as true, seasoned, and fully trained investigators would have the same going over the case?
Right. I know a couple of investigators that couldn't investigate their way out of a paper bag. And I know some hobbyists that are absolute geniuses. So to answer your question, let's say, because I've read some articles and things like that, and they have asserted that to certain investigators of Roswell. But those investigators started 30 years ago. Well, I would assert that those investigators are now investigators, whether they were hobbyists or not. And I get the point also, do you work 40 hours a week as an investigator, or do you, spend 5 hours, 10 hours a week looking through some paper, searching online, doing stuff like that? Yes, there is definite delineation between someone who's doing the job for money and then somebody who is a hobbyist. So I would assert that Barack Obama graduated from Harvard and George Bush graduated from Harvard. I think they both have two very different skill sets, but they have the same essentially, the same credential agency gave them their credentials. So, while there will be a whole bunch of people that will say one or the other is completely incompetent, there'll be as many as, the reverse opinion. So, does it sound like I'm trying to defend the guys?
Kind of. But, I respect your professionalism because I must tell you, Kevin Randall is a good friend. Kevin Randall has a show here on this network.
Oh, does he? Okay.
And, I respect Kevin.
I love Kevin. He doesn't know me. I've never met the man.
But he is a professionally trained law enforcement officer.
Yes. And also has, military experience.
Exactly. He's a colonel, a retired lieutenant colonel. So, that says credibility. You, former police officer, law enforcement officer, detective, credibility. No doubt about it. Then I kind of look at Stanton T. Friedman, nuclear physicist. Stanton's made his mark not as a nuclear physicist, but as a ufologist. So do I give Stanton all the credit that I would give Kevin Randall or you? No, I don't.
Well, I appreciate that. Stanton Friedman's one of my favorite human beings on the earth.
Yeah.
If it weren't for him in 1978, looking through some things and then deciding, he was going to, push things further, and then eventually, interviewing Jesse Marcel, that was huge in this deal.
But how credible was Jesse Marcel? This opens up a whole box of questions, as to the information that Jesse Marcel has been spewing or had been spewing prior to his demise. Like Jesse Marcel as a law enforcement officer or even a member of the military intelligence or intelligence community, foobarred big time when he went out to the Brazil ranch, got what was supposed to be evidence, went back home, woke up his wife and kid and let them tamper with evidence. Right then and there, the Roswell case is over.
Looking at a contemporary view of it, today's view, absolutely. Anybody who would do that today would have just completely destroyed the investigation.
Well, what is so different from today than it was at the end of World War II in the place where the two nuclear bombs that devastated Nagasaki and Hiroshima took off, or where this nuclear development had taken place? Like, excuse me, shouldn't the people at that base, whether or not it was World War II or if it was post-war or if it was during the Cold War, should they have not had the common sense not to lose the chain of evidence?
I don't even know if there was a word. I don't even know if there was a phrase of chain of evidence. There was obviously evidence, but I don't know whether or not in 1947 that there was actually that word or that those two words. When you're looking at 1947, you're looking at the U.S. Army Air Corps transitioning to the United States Air Force.
Right.
So I would guess that they're trying to figure out what manuals they're going to follow, what policies they're going to do, how they're going to change their uniforms.
Okay.
The whole bit.
I can understand that, and I can appreciate that. But what was it with this evidence that Marcel picked up that he found it so necessary to do something that he had never done before, or we are not aware of that he had never done before?
Right. So, and that leads back also to Mac Brazel, who found the debris. Depending on what account you look at, why would in the world would he wait 3 weeks to report it to anybody or report it to anybody of import?
Could Mark Brazel been part of the plot, the conspiracy, the cover-up? Could Mark Brazel have been paid by the government in order to be part of the charade?
I don't think he was paid anything. Are you talking about Brazel or Marcel?
Brazel.
Brazel. Okay. There was a lot of suggestions of that. There were, there are stories about, he brings the debris in, he brings it to the sheriff. The sheriff turns it over to the, Roswell Army Airfield. Couple of days go by, there's some investigations going on, and he ends up showing up later with a brand new truck, and he won't talk to anybody, and he, there was some odd behavior.
Sure was.
Depending on, the storyline and where you get it. And you're getting these storylines 30 years later. Now, Stanton and a lot of other people, Kevin Randall being one of them, they went back in and tried to vet where this information was coming from, and so you can say, well, I remember my grandmother talking about that. I'm not even going to go into all the, I was going to get my degree in psychology until I realized I don't want to hear your problems, which, kind of put a big kibosh on that. But in doing that, I also understand that memory is malleable, and people will argue with me all the time that, well, ever since I was 6 years old, I know 1 + 1 is 1. Yeah. That's some rote memory that you have stored away, but episodic memory and regular day-to-day memory, that memory tends to change over time. And it changes because you don't go back and think about it every day. It changes because, 6 months later you go, what happened there? Oh yeah, that's what happened. And those little, the little proteins that are storing your memories up in your brain are, if you don't exercise those proteins all the time, they fall away. And then when you revisit that memory, there'd be little things missing, and you'll go ahead and fill it in. And I can show people this with just basic visual tests and things like that on how your brain will automatically fill in the gaps. And it does it with memory, it does it with vision, it does it, with complex motor skills. So, all of these things are going to, cause a problem. So, when Kevin Randall and all these other individuals that came in, and, you need to vet your memories, and memories are vetted through, thank God for newspapers, thank God for the First Amendment, thank God for personal letters, diaries, logbooks, all of those things. So there was a huge amount of research done just trying to find those vetting materials, those actual, substantial supportive evidence to say this is what the story was. When you go in and you say, hey, I want to talk to all these people at this little restaurant. You walk in and you say, hey, I'm writing a book, and I'm writing a book about Roswell, and I'm looking for people that know something about Roswell. I want to, list you in my book. Does anybody know anything? And everybody's hands go up because everybody wants to be in the book. So, there are much more clever ways to gather that information than actually advertising that we're looking for people to put in our book.
But what about the information from the Army Air Force itself? What about the information from the Roswell base? What about the information from the sheriff's office? What about the information from the intelligence agency itself? What about stuff in the with the Pentagon? Obviously, if this was in fact a UFO from another planet, as Stanton Friedman and those who have put Roswell on the map want to believe, should there not be conclusive proof, a smoking gun somewhere?
I had this huge grin on my face as you were putting all that out. You would think. I often fall back on, when I do my presentations of this, and once again, I will be the first one to say it. I stole all my information from all these guys that have already done the work. When you go back and you look at the individuals that are kind of key to the Roswell incident,
right?
You could throw back to Kenneth Arnold's, reporting discs or whatever you want to say that he reported. Just a few weeks prior to this. So, there was already, information in the newspaper about what was going on. But you sit here and look at this, and you go, okay, Mac Brazel, he's a rancher. The only thing that makes any sense to me of his, the 3-week span or thereabouts of him first seeing it and then talking to some other neighbors, and they say, yeah, you need to take it to the sheriff. And then, 3 weeks later or so, he takes the stuff to the sheriff. Now, I know you or me or anybody else that, didn't just crawl out from under a rock. If you found some substantial debris that was extraterrestrial, you would know it to be something very unusual, and I think you would do something about it right away. So the only other explanation is this was some sort of experimental aircraft or, some sort of a secret type project, or what he found was debris that, a high velocity, large aircraft or spacecraft hit the ground at a high velocity and skipped just like a rock on on water.
Right.
And so that would explain better what Brazel found.
But what about Project Mogul? Where does this fit into the entire equation?
Well, that didn't come in until much later. But as far as Mogul goes, for those that are listening that don't know what Mogul is, it's a design of a balloon train. There's several balloons that are tied onto one lead, and that lead lifts an apparatus that would have what would be in effect a large microphone, and it would go very high in the air, and it would listen for the Soviets if they were going to explode atomic weapons. So that was one of the things, and that would be very secretive for us to do. We wouldn't want the Soviets to know that. But you could also look at some other stuff that was going on over at Alamogordo,
right,
with New York University, and they were practicing with constant level balloons that would go to a certain level and stay at that level. And, you can get balloons going very fast if you get them up in the jet stream. They can travel a very, very long way and serve multiple purposes like that. So, there was many different little things that could cross over, and the ridiculous stories of people, the people that later, remember this is 30 years later or so, that are trying to correlate some of the side stories of the small bodies, getting the small caskets, seeing small bodies, and then the government saying, well, those were probably parachute dummies. Some of those were, used in World War II that were much smaller, which doesn't apparently indicate that they were ever used in New Mexico, but I can't confirm or deny that. There were other larger, full-size parachute dummies that were used for experiments for pilots exiting out of aircraft. So, a lot of things start getting layered over on top of one another, and it gets things confusing. And that's why I always try to rein people back and go, look, this investigation is about Kenneth Arnold and what he said. It's about Mac Brazel and what he found. It's about Lloyd and Loretta Proctor, encouraging Mac to go in and turn over the information to the sheriff, George Wilcox. And this is about Colonel Blanchard, authorizing a release in the Roswell Daily Record that a saucer was found, and this guy wasn't fired. How does that happen? How does a colonel in charge, as the commander of the Roswell Army Airfield, release or authorize a release that he's found a flying saucer, and somebody doesn't come in and commit him to a mental hospital, or at least bare minimum fire him for turning around the next day and saying it's a balloon?
All right, let's let our listeners ponder about that fact as you and I take a short break at the bottom of the hour. Greg Lawson is our special guest, X-Zone Nation. His website is www.authorgreglawson.com. And Greg and I will be back on the other side of this break in 4 minutes as we continue talking about the world of the paranormal, the science of parapsychology, and this hour, well, for now anyway, the Roswell, New Mexico crash, incident, whatever you'd like to call it. We'll be back. Don't go away. Welcome back, everyone. This is the X Zone. I am Rob McConnell. Greg Lawson is our very special guest this hour, www.authorgreglawson.com. And Greg, before we went to the break, we were talking about the Roswell incidents, the press release, and so on. But let's take a look in the year 2016. What has changed over all these years since the name of Roswell, New Mexico, and the possibility of a UFO crash there? Has there been anything that can be added to the mix? Are we any closer, in your opinion, of finding out what really happened there?
I don't think so.
No way.
And the reason I say that is I think we talked about this a little bit last show when I was on, was a homicide that I worked. It was a long, protracted investigation, and there was a lot of things that were going on. But every time there were two suspects, and every time I interviewed these suspects, they changed their story. And so by the end of the investigation, I get warrants for both of them, put them in jail forever, and I have no idea what happened. Because I was lied to so many times. I don't know what happened. I know that they killed her. I know that for a fact. What I don't know is the actual sequence of events,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't know. And so that's where we are with Roswell. We have a cold case. We have no substantial physical evidence.
Mm-hmm.
And you will have investigators who will say, well, no, we do. We have evidence that the government has right now. It's in, building 18, it's wherever it is. And we need to find it. I said, well, when you don't have the evidence,
Mm-hmm.
In any murder, there's evidence. So there may be evidence, but it's at the bottom of the lake and I don't know where it is and I can't go get it. So I don't have evidence. So it's this whole line of deception that has happened with Roswell from the beginning, and then a 30-year hiatus, and then a resurrection, and then there's all this supposition now. So the story is very malleable. It's changed over time. You have people, where it started off where it's just some debris and it's just a balloon. And then 30 years later, 1989 comes around and Glenn Dennis is watching Unsolved Mysteries. And all of a sudden he sees the Roswell crash. Well, he was the mortician at Ballard Funeral Home at the time there in Roswell. He comes out and says, well, I received a call from Roswell Army Airfield about getting some caskets, some small child caskets. So he goes on with all this. Tom Schmidt Don Schmidt and Tom Carey
Mm-hmm.
Do extensive work with him, and basically they basically impeach him in the line of the story that he told. And there were some other incidents as far as people's names that he changed over time, and then
Right.
and then all of a sudden, that was in 1989, and in 1991 he opens a business known as the International UFO Museum and Research Center. So that the cynical people could definitely look and go, wow, he created a business for himself or income or whatever.
Well, haven't a lot of people done that with Roswell?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's where I come in and go, you know what? You can say whatever you want to about Glenn Dennis. I don't know whether or not he lied. And I don't know whether or not he believed what he said, but he helped open up an investigation that I think a lot of people are very interested in, and a lot of people feel that it should be brought out. But it's one of those situations where if you say they're ghosts and a ghost shows up, well, you're right. And if you say there's ghosts and there's no ghost show up, well, they didn't show up right now. They'll show up later. So you always have later to fall back on.
But 40 years of all these people, Kevin Randall, Tom Carey, and every UFO investigator that you can think of who's gone to Roswell, all the TV shows, all the radio shows, all the newspaper reports, all the magazine articles, you would think that with all this attention, if all this attention was given to a homicide cold case, there would be one heck of a chance that some evidence would be developed or some memory jarred that would lead investigators to a smoking gun. But all these years of all these people writing all these books, doing all these conferences, this, that, and the other thing, nothing.
Right. And of course, they say, well, this balloon debris, what did they do with that? Well, my answer to that is I've been in the military. I imagine they threw it away. In 1947, prior to that, maybe 1945 or so, you crash an airplane on, an airstrip. Well, you get a bulldozer and you get it out of the way so you can land another airplane there. It wasn't like, this big mystery. Oh my God, how did this thing crash? Well, it crashed. Something failed or it was human error and it crashed. And we need to get it out of the way and move on. And in our culture today, that would never happen. We do, accident reconstruction. We get all kinds of, people in there that specialize in this, and they do that. And I think a lot of times we attribute what we do today with what they were doing back then. And that's why I always fall back on the key players. The way you know something is either somebody tells you about it, you witnessed it, or you did it. That's the only three ways that something happens. So when you're looking at an investigation like this, who are the key players? Well, obviously the key players, are the guys that did this elaborate cover-up.
Yeah.
And I don't think anybody that could spend 50 minutes reading this, would not say, okay, this was definitely a cover-up. It was a government cover-up, whether they were covering up, a spaceship crash from another planet, or some sort of aircraft crash from another country or our country, some secret aircraft, or it was a secretive, some sort of project. There's no doubt that that's what happened here. And as we discussed before, you send the intelligence officer of the Roswell Army Airfield to go out and gather debris. I don't know about you, but I've never known any officers sent out to, it's usually, if you're going to go out and gather debris, you might have an officer, but you're going to have several enlisted people that are going to carry the shovels to do this.
Exactly, and that's another good point. Why did he go out there alone?
Well, he didn't. He went out there with Captain Sheridan Cabot. But the thing about it is Cabot later completely denies any involvement. Once he gets, elderly, then he admits to it, but just kind of laughs about it and continues to spin stories out of it. But you have to look at what Captain Cabot's job was. He was a counterintelligence officer. And so you have, the intelligence officer from Roswell Army Airfield, who is the guy that's going to gather information. And then you have the counterintelligence guy from Roswell Army Airfield, whose job is to spin information and turn it into something else.
Wow.
So from the very beginning, here's this material turned in. From the very beginning, Blanchard sends out, assuming it came from Blanchard, Colonel Blanchard. He sends out his counterintelligence officer, and a non-commissioned officer was a high-ranking non-commissioned officer, Rickett, Sergeant Rickett, and so you send this group of people out there that their job is to gather information and then turn it into something else. So, that leads to the theory of the skipping spacecraft. The spacecraft came in at a very high speed and at a sharp angle, and it skips off the ground and it crashes 20 miles, 30 miles, wherever further. Mm-hmm. So you send a couple of guys out there to wag the tail and gather up a little bit of information and say that's your only thing. And then there's this hypothesis, I guess you might say, theory that the big group of military recovery specialists, you could say, or security people, go to the actual crash site.
Which was where?
Well, if I knew that, I'd be a very rich man at this point.
Is it possible, based on the fact that there is no record of the second crash, or there's no indication who did what, when, where, why, or how, that there was no other crash site except what they found at Brazel's farm?
Well, I would just lead your listeners to the crash at Corona by Stan Freeman.
Oh, there's another. Yes. Why is Stan Friedman so highly regarded as, well, Stan Friedman said it, it must be true. Stan Friedman wrote it, it must be true. Stan Friedman, brought out Roswell with no evidence, but it must be true because Stan Friedman said it.
Well, I don't know, the qualitative level of the information that he's passed out. I don't know how to rate that, but a few hundred years ago, people would look up in the sky and say, "See the sun move across the sky." Mm-hmm. And then a guy came up, Copernicus came up and said, "I don't think so. I think we're circling around the sun and we're spinning."
Right.
And so that's all perception.
Right, but over time, we were able to prove Copernicus right.
Because we had evidence to do so.
Right. Because
and when we don't have evidence,
it's a theory. It's
right.
It's a folklore. It's a myth. It's a lie. It's a misconception. It's a misdirection. It's false evidence. And yet we still think that Stanton Friedman is the be-all of UFOs. I don't agree with that.
Well, like I said, I don't know whether he is or not. I just know that he has dedicated far more time into gathering opinion and information from a lot of different people, and just putting it out there.
And I'm sure he's made a lot of money doing it.
I hope so.
Because
he's worked really hard at it.
Follow the money.
Yeah,
it's that plain. It's that simple.
And so, if you're looking, there's so many hypotheses out there as far as just or scenarios that people could go through to say, okay, what caused the stir? Yeah. Why in the world would somebody put this in the newspaper like that? Why would they recant it? And why would it surface 30 years later?
That is an excellent question. Like, why didn't it cause all this stir 30 years ago? What's different?
It's hugely different today, society. In 1947, for the most part, that was right before the Red Scare. Mm-hmm. That was right before, they were so worried. I mean, they were worried about the Soviets. Yeah. But we still enjoyed the fall. I don't know if it's false. We still enjoyed the belief that we could trust our government. We still enjoyed the belief that, the military was going to tell us the truth, and that, for the most part, those people in politics were somewhat truthful.
But how do we know that the government isn't lying about it? Why do we always assume that when it comes to Roswell, the government is lying. There's a truth embargo. Stan Friedman and all the other UFO investigators, they're telling the truth. Like,
Well,
it's like saying, well, you know what? Even though they said they didn't have a private email server, they had it. But, because it's Hillary Clinton, she can't be telling a lie.
Yeah. Well, I've been to a few interview schools, and I can just point out some things on any of the political people as far as the little keys to know when they're lying and when they're not. But I digress. The thing that is very interesting about it is today we live, I think, in a post-truth society. Today, lies are given equal credit or equal support that truth does. I mean, we could sit there and listen to people on TV and we know it's a lie, and we just go, I'm going to go ahead and vote for him anyway or her anyway, because
in the media, Greg, you know this as well as I do. If it don't bleed, it don't lead.
Oh yeah.
Okay, so years ago.
Yeah, one of the things as a law enforcement person, as soon as you say, look, I would like to exculpate you from this crime. I want to remove you from being a suspect in this crime. So I think what we can do is set you up with a polygraph.
Yeah.
You pass the polygraph, and I will change that little moniker in front of your name from suspect to witness or to other or to involved or whatever, but you're not going to be a suspect anymore. And when somebody says, nah, I'm not going to do that, well, a lot of cops go, well, then he did it.
Right.
That's it. Why wouldn't you go in and do this?
But I can understand your reasoning using this in a law enforcement scenario. But the very test that these people refuse to take is the very test that they base all of their evidence on when somebody claims to be abducted by aliens. They passed a polygraph test or they failed a polygraph test. They use hypnosis and all these other pseudo-sciences to prove their case. In fact, they are convinced that if the UFO case was to be brought into a court of law, a civil court of law, that they would win based on the evidence they have.
I've heard many people say that, and I use the word indict, because I like the whole, I want probable cause instead of reasonable suspicion or, whatever you want. I like a higher level. So I say, when you look at the Roswell incident, would you indict this incident? Would you say absolutely a flying saucer crashed here?
Right.
And you can't do that based on public opinion.
I know that. You know that.
And that's one of the falsehoods that has happened with the Roswell lore is many people are convinced, quantitatively that because I have 600 people that says it happened, it really happened.
Right.
And once again, that's a perspective,
of those 600 people.
Yeah. And that's a belief for you that is what makes it true. I am I'm a stat-driven and evidence guy, and if I don't have supportive evidence to firmly attach to this incident, I can't indict. It leaves that reasonable, it drops it down to reasonable suspicion that something happened here, but not probable cause.
Unless you're Johnny Cochran and you try to put a glove on your hand.
Yeah, you can do that.
I would love to see a smoking gun. And I've asked many people the same question I'm going to ask you. With all the hacking that is going on today around the world by all the different governmental agencies, would it not be advantageous to a a group of hackers, whether WikiLeaks or another government, who I'm sure must know that the Roswell case is a thorn in the side of many Americans. And if they wanted to topple the government, would not one way be to hack into the government computers, find the facts, release the facts that, yes, Roswell did happen. This is the government file on this, that, and the other thing. And yet, over the years, there has been no evidence to substantiate the claim of any validity when it comes to UFOs that have been brought forward by any hacker or WikiLeaks or anything like that.
Yes, and obviously that would solve a lot of problems.
Right.
One of the things with most law enforcement agencies is none of the records, or even the records that were updated, let's say in the late 80s, early 90s, that stuff had to be hand put in. So all the reports prior to that are archived somewhere. And so unless they actually assign somebody to go, okay, get the Roswell file and I want you to put it in the computer, well, it's not there. And it would be archived somewhere if anybody wrote a report on it. And like I said, today, of course, you would write a report. In 1947, maybe not. Maybe you'll take the debris by your house and let your kid dig around in it.
But isn't it also possible? I've got about a minute left here, Greg. Isn't it also possible that what all these proponents of a UFO conspiracy cover up when it comes to Roswell, New Mexico, never really happened? And that is why they can't find any evidence to substantiate their claims.
It is possible. And that's, like I said, when you say, no, it didn't happen, well, you don't really get anything accomplished personally. But when you said it did happen and it's hidden, well, it either is going to be, brought to the forefront, or it'll be hidden forever, and you can just keep saying, yeah, it's going to be hidden, and they need to release the information. So as long as you have that perspective, you win.
Greg, I want to thank you ever so much for joining us. It's a great pleasure talking to you. I love the way that you think and the way that you conduct your investigations. And I look forward to the time when you and I can meet here again in the X Zone. But until that time, let our listeners know how they can find out more about you and if they have any evidence that they would like to contact you with.
Thanks. That's great. Yeah, you can contact me at www.authorgreglawson, all one word, .com. I have a contact link there, and you can send me an email. And I really enjoyed it. Thanks a lot for this opportunity.
Greg, take care of yourself.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Bye-bye now. Exonation, Greg Lawson has been my guest this hour, www.authorgreglawson.com. I'll be back on the other side of this short news break as we continue here in the X Zone from our broadcast center in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. Coming up next, Debbie Chestnut will be joining us. And whatever you do, don't go Exonation, because this is truly the place where people dare to believe and dare to be heard. My name is Rob McConnell. Whatever you do, don't go away.